This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, I'm super jazzed about today. Many of my favorite researchers and favorite farmers are here today, so I'm really looking forward to the rest of the day. So my name is John Wallace. I just started at Cornell, and I'm going to be working in specialty crop systems. And when it comes to talking about how to use cover crops to suppress weeds, I really feel like I'm just the messenger. So I've really had the pleasure to work with a host of researchers in the Northeast for the last several years who have been thinking about this, and the ideas I'm going to talk about a lot longer than me. And then an important part of this story are the farmers who are putting these ideas into practice, and several gentlemen who have provided engineering solutions that have allowed us to use cover crops in new ways. And then I also thought it was important to note that when this group of scientists over here, when we write papers, we typically end up citing the work of Chuck Moeller and John Teasdale, who did a lot of really the important early work looking at cover crop and weed interactions. So I'm working off of the assumption that since you guys are here today, we're going to be in general agreement that cover crops are a potential tool in the integrated weed management toolbox, or one of the many little hammers that we can employ to achieve certain long-term weed management objectives. And so when we think about long-term integrated weed management, we're thinking about maintaining low weed seed banks in annual cropping systems, and also preventing population spikes, so kind of buffering against those years when we have poor weed control and really high weed seed rain. And then also what we want to do with an integrated weed management approach is to prevent weeds that become adapted to our system, so adapted weed species. And so we know a little bit about the mechanisms by which cover crops suppress weeds and disrupt weed life cycles. And so whether we're talking about a living cover or surface mulch residue, we know that the cover crops can affect what's going on in the weed seed bank by alternating germination cues, so light quality, changes in soil temperature, soil moisture that trigger weed seed germination. Cover crops can also enhance habitat for seed predators, so granivores, that can also help drive down weed seed banks. And we also have some evidence that cover crops influence microbial diversity in the soil, and that diversity can contribute to greater weed seed decay. And then above ground, we know that a living cover through competition or the surface mulch through physical interference can kind of preempt resources away from weeds and influence by altering soil moisture dynamics, nitrogen availability, increasing competition for light, and all those things can contribute to either mortality of emerged weeds or at least kind of decreasing the amount of seed rain in annual cropping systems. So the intensity by which cover crops influence those weed life cycles is really a function of certain life history traits of weeds, and as well where you're employing cover crops within a rotation. And so if we're kind of thinking about business as usual, where we're using cover crops in the shoulder seasons within an annual crop rotation, we're very likely to have pretty dramatic effects on winter annual weeds like mare's tail that germinate in the fall or in the spring. But we may kind of have marginal effects on summer annual weed species. So we might prevent some weed seed germination for early emerging summer annuals, but for summer annuals that have peak emergence periods in a summer annual crop, cover crops likely have pretty marginal effects on weed dynamics. And so, in the two extremes, and when we're in an annual crop rotation, say in a full tillage organic system or in a continuous no-till conventional system, we're relying on either these big hammers, tillage, or multiple passes of herbicides, we're very likely to be still selecting for adapted weed species in those systems, and cover crops may have a marginal effect. So what I'd like to talk about today is opportunities for making cover crops a bigger hammer in the integrated weed management toolbox in conservation tillage systems, both organic and conventional systems, by moving cover crops closer or into summer annual crop rotations. And so the two common things going on there are the need to move away from kind of business as usual and either terminating a cover crop with herbicides or tillage early and delaying termination to allow cover crops to get big, and then relying on surface mulch residue for increased weed suppression. So we've been working, we know quite a bit about using this kind of high residue cover crop mulch system in organic systems. So in the Northeast, there's been probably over a decade of research looking at this system in what we would call a cover crop based or organic rotational no-till system. And so what I want to do is just touch on how that system works, what we've learned, and then if we can take what we've learned from that system and start to employ that in more of a conventional continuous no-till system to really make cover crops a bigger tool in the integrated weed management toolbox. So we employ this system both in a no-till corn or a no-till soybean phase of the rotation. And I'm just going to use, for example, a no-till soybean system. So in this particular system, many of you are going to be familiar with it. The idea is to grow a big cover crop, and so we really prioritize optimizing getting that cover crop established in front of soybeans who are typically growing cereal rye. So we're getting that cover crop in early at a high seeding rate with the idea of growing a big cover. And we're terminating cereal rye at flowering, at thesis with a roller crimper. And then we're no-till planting soybeans directly into that mulch. And what's critical is this trade-off of when we're doing minimal kind of disturbance at planting in row, we do a better job of suppressing weeds, but we consistently see a trade-off where sometimes it's harder to get a good crop establishment when we're planting into that big residue. And so we're not always going to get the biomass that we think we need. So typically in that system, we think we probably need about 3 tons of dry matter biomass to get a really good weed suppressive mulch when we terminate the cover crop. And so we've been thinking about integrated weed management approaches. And so we've been integrating the use of a high residue cultivator in this system. And so the way that works is there's these high residue sweeps. They're about 20 inches wide. And they don't invert the soil, so they kill weeds by actually severing the roots. And so that allows you to go in later than what we would typically use inter-row cultivation and make what we have found is 2 passes about 4 or 5 weeks after planting generally optimizes in-row weed control when we integrate this high residue cultivator into the system. So here's some data from a long-term organic cropping systems experiment that's looking at these rotational no-till approaches at Penn State. This is some data from Rebecca Champagne, who's a master's student there. And so in this cropping systems experiment at Penn State, we have, we're comparing kind of full tillage soybean production with this rotational no-till approach using the cover crops and the roller crimper. And so this data is late season weed biomass for 3 different crop years. And the weed biomass is broken down by in-row weeds and then between-row weeds. And so on the x-axis, you can also see the number of cultivation passes. So for the full tillage system, we're using blind cultivation or inter-row cultivation somewhere between 3 or 6 times a year, depending on weather conditions. And then kind of adaptively using high-residue cultivation in the no-till system. And you can see here what kind of biomass we were getting with the cereal rye cover crop. So looking at this data, what have we really learned about the viability of the no-till approach? One is that if you look across the rotation, we're seeing pretty comparable levels of weed suppression between the no-till approach and the full tillage approach. And we also are seeing that both of these types of systems are pretty vulnerable to weed control failures, and those weed control failures are primarily a function of weed control failures in row. So in 2016, in the full tillage, right after planting, we stayed wet. We couldn't get in and do blind cultivation. And then when it dried up, we couldn't get those weeds out of the row. The story is a little bit different in the no-till system. So in that system, we had a pretty high weed seed bank inputs in 2016, which was a challenging year. And the in-row weeds are probably due to too much soil disturbance at planting. And then we're also finding that, which I think is important, because a lot of the original work was really thinking about driving up cereal rye biomass to get a better weed suppressive mulch. And we see that from year to year, weed control is not really a function of how much cereal rye biomass. And part of that is the ability to have this integrated approach where we use high residue cultivation. And what I'm not showing is the weed species breakdown, and if I did, what you would see is both of these systems are pretty vulnerable to species becoming adapted. So in each year, the proportion of total weeds, we saw giant foxtail become more and more dominant in these systems. And so it's just another data point that suggests that we need to think about integrated approaches within season and across rotations to really manage weeds. Okay, so what are the opportunities for kind of thinking about using this high residue surface mulch approach in continuous conventional no-till systems? And so we've been thinking about that, and one of the things that have made this approach more conceivable is this small engineering solution. So this is a integrated roller crimper. It's called a ZRX, Zone Residue Manager system. Don Biologic sells it now. It was fabricated by a Pennsylvania no-till farmer. And what this allows you to do is to roll and plant in one pass. So you can mount these on the frame ahead of your no-till planter. So there'd be a slicing residue behind here, followed by the no-till planter units. And it also allows you to be a little more aggressive with these double disc row cleaners in row. And so when we're using herbicides in this system, we can be a little more aggressive to make sure that we're establishing a good crop. And use herbicides to control weeds in the row. And so we've been trying to think about how this approach is going to influence herbicide programs or the use of herbicides in these systems. And so there's a couple of things going on. One, when we're using kind of the roller crimper approach in a conventional system, we have a lot more flexibility in when we terminate the cover crop. And that's really important because it's not really just how much biomass you're getting, but we're consistently challenged by weather conditions when you can get into the field and terminate a cover crop. And so being able to use burn down herbicides allow us a little more flexibility in managing the cover crop residue. And then what we would like to think is that by moving to this kind of higher residue mulch approach, we have the opportunities to reduce the amount of residual herbicides or post-herbicides that we're going to rely on in a continuous no-till system. And that is really critical, given that Northeast is now seeing the introduction of more and more glyphosate-resistant weeds in our no-till cropping systems. And so, thinking broadly about this, we're thinking that adopting this approach of these higher residue mulch systems in continuous no-till is potentially critical enough where we're thinking about preserving conservation tillage systems by diversifying our weed management approach, which allows us to preserve effective herbicides, and we do that by preventing the evolution of herbicide-resistant weeds. And if that's going to happen, we really think that what's necessary is for cover crops and herbicide programs to be complementary. And so when we're thinking about complementarity between herbicides and cover crops, we're thinking about three things. So this is how we're thinking about it. If cover crops are complementary, if at the time of a herbicide application, we're spraying fewer weeds. Because if we're spraying fewer weeds, we're moving selection pressure away from herbicides, and that mortality pressure is coming from the cover crops, and that's a positive thing. 5 minutes, okay. So, and then it's also complementary if we're reducing weed size at the time of application. So extension weed scientists everywhere always talk about the finger rule or the soda can rule, and that killing weeds with herbicides is a dose is about dose response. And so if weeds are smaller, one drop of a herbicide is going to be more effective when they're smaller. At the same time, if we're spraying smaller weeds and we're spraying through a cover crop, there's the potential for kind of interference from the cover crop, and that may potentially reduce herbicide efficacy. So I'm just going to show some data that kind of looks at this complementarity issue. And so this is a mare's tail example. So mare's tail is a winter annual weed. It's probably the poster child for glyphosate-resistant weeds in the Northeast. And so the selection pressure is occurring at burn down. And so what we would like to see is to spray fewer mare's tail plants at burn down. And what this data shows is across 4 different years, this is mare's tail density. The black lines are a no cover crop plot. The green lines are where we had a cereal rye cover crop. And you can see that in 3 out of 4 years, the potential for reducing the number of weeds that we're spraying, removing selection pressure away from those herbicides, is potentially greater than 90%. So that's a really positive outcome. So this is the same data, and so how big were those horseweed plants when we were using a burn down herbicide to kill them? And so the top, this is 2 different years, and the top is with the no cover, the bottom is with cereal rye, and you can see that when we don't have the cover, we're increasing the probability of violating the soda can rule. So we're spraying bigger weeds when we don't have the cover crop there. And when we do have the cover crop, we've really constrained weed size, and we're spraying smaller weeds. Okay, so this is some data from Jess Bunchek, who is working on this idea of interference, so the potential for cover crops to interfere with the efficacy of herbicides. And so this is, this is herbicide spray coverage at the time of burn down herbicide application. This is the amount of ground cover that we have. And so you see the control, cereal rye, and a rye hairy vetch cover crop. And you can see that as you increase ground cover with a cover crop, the deposition of the herbicide goes down. And so this is potential negative trade-off associated with using cover crops. Oh, yeah, so I have pictures. So that's the picture. She was using spray cards to actually measure this. So that's the herbicide deposition in a no cover crop plot and in a hairy vetch cereal rye cover crop. Got a couple more slides?
You
Okay. All right. So, so that's kind of winter annuals where we really have kind of potential to really drive weed suppression or increase weed suppression with cover cropping. So what about those summer annual weeds that have peak emergence periods in crop, particularly late emerging weeds like pigweed species? And so how much weed suppression can we get out of that surface mulch residue? And so this is a data set from the same set of experiments where we're looking at pigweed density at the time of a post-emergent application, so about 3 weeks after planting. And this is on the x-axis, you have cereal rye biomass at burn down. And so we have no cover crop plots. We have cereal rye plots where we terminated at the boot stage and then where we terminated at the heading stage. And you can see that increasing the amount of biomass prior to termination increases the surface residue. And while compared to horseweed, it may be a more marginal effect, we're still driving down, or we're still increasing weed suppression on those summer annual weeds. Same idea with what are we doing to weed size? So probably not as demonstrable as kind of the horseweed data, but we're still seeing that when we have the surface mulch residue there, we have fewer weeds that are getting big at the time of a post-emergent application. And so we're probably slightly more probable to violate the finger rule or the soda can rule in the no cover crop control. Okay, so just to wrap things up, I would like to think from this data that the question of can we make cover crops a bigger tool in the toolbox in an integrated weed management approach by moving to this high residue surface mulch. We see a lot of signs that this could be effective, but I also didn't talk about all the potential agronomic trade-offs. I talked about the weed suppression benefits. And so if we want to move forward and make this something that is really viable, there's still some challenges. And so in the organic system, in the organic no-till system, I think one of the critical challenges is just getting these consistent crop stands while minimizing in-row disturbance. And so that might be just a technological fix. In conventional systems, we still have all these question marks. So what about this interference question, trade-offs? Are we adding additional pest pressure other than weeds, yield drags due to shortened seasons? So these are important questions. I talked solely about cereal rye alone. I didn't talk about mixtures. So when we start thinking about integrating cover crop mixtures into the question, we may be able to have greater weed suppression, but probably increase the complexity of management. And then finally, this approach requires investments in capital and new equipment. And so is that investment really worth long-term conservation benefits? Sorry. Okay, so I hope I have time for a couple questions or comments. Okay.
Early in your slides, when you were talking about the conventional tillage versus the no tillage and the weed density, were you using the same cultivator in both systems all year?
The no-till approach versus the...
Yeah, which cultivation?
Oh, yeah, so totally different cultivation equipment. So in the no-till systems, we're using that high residue sweep, so one sweep, and then in the full tillage system, we would be using blind cultivation, so either a tine weed or a rotary harrow, and then just inter-row cultivation. Okay. Yeah.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.